Hi there, it's Marla at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam begins the Mother Mary series by looking at what it encompassed for Mary to say yes to her calling. What if the life of faith means trusting we are being led to a place we do not know on a journey we do not control? Enjoy the first message in this 4-week series.
Hey, good morning. It's really, really great to see you. If you're a guest with us, perfect timing because you're catching us at the beginning of the movie, so to speak. We're kicking off a brand new conversation called Mother Mary. Real quickly, though, in reference to Christmas Eve, thanks for those of you who are already committed to being a part of serving. You know, we grew into this. It wasn't ever like this, hey, let's someday do it at the Civic Center. We just tried to host Christmas Eve here at Grand Street and do it well. And what we saw over the years was more and more interest in that. And so a couple years ago, because of a bunch of volunteers, a bunch of owners from this place, we moved it to the Civic Center, which is a huge undertaking. And so thanks. We just recognize that volunteering on Christmas Eve isn't at the top of anybody's list. So thanks for being a part of that with us. And that's not in any way to go like, and those of you who aren't, how dare you call yourself a Christian? That's not what I'm trying to say at all. That's not at all the point. It's just to say thank you to those who are. The other thing is, you know, one of the things that I love about what I get to do is how things like ales and wood splitting and the variety of different scattering things we do, how it allows us to connect and create partnerships in some ways with unlikely organizations, or at least what wouldn't be typical. And it's very humbling for us as a church, I think, to see that it's not just churches that care about people, but the city cares about people and the different businesses care about people. And just wanted to brag on this one. So one of our biggest challenges with Christmas Eve is getting all of our stuff from the Grand Street to the Civic Center. It's quite a challenge, and you know, they have a loading ramp that's like normal truck height, and so even a U-Haul really doesn't get it done because we got all these big, heavy freight boxes. And so there's a guy from here, maybe more than one, but I know who's a part of, who works at Mergenthaler, and we just reached out to him and went like, hey, could we hire you to come do this horrible thing on Christmas Eve, you know? And so not only did they say yes, I mean, they're charging us an embarrassingly small sum, which don't call them and say like, hey, I heard you're doing this for Narrate, you need to do this for me. Don't do that. But they're going to show up on Friday afternoon. What is that, like the 22nd? 22nd. They're going to let us load all of our stuff Friday afternoon. They're going to park the thing. Don't steal the stuff either because it'll be sitting there for a little while. And then we get to get it out of there on Christmas Eve, first thing in the morning, and then they're going to help us Christmas Eve night get all this stuff back here. So pretty awesome, just really, really neat community that we get to be a part of. So all that being said, Mother Mary, not quite probably what you're thinking about as art. We'll get to that. Do you ever find yourself, though, just stymied by your own issues with control? You know, like, did you ever find yourself deeply frustrated with your need to control lots of things? This morning, I want to talk lots about you and not at all about myself. So we're just going to talk about your problems here this morning. But you know, like, and for me, part of what's tricky about it is the older I get on this issue of control, there's this, and maybe God's going to zap me for saying this, but there's this sense of like, on the one hand, my ability to identify something I want and go get that, like that's part of why I am in life where I am, and that sounds really gross, but hopefully you can relate. And on the other hand, what I recognize is that same ability wreaks havoc on my relationships, you know? Like, do you ever find yourself like just stymied by like, okay, so when is the right thing to insist on a certain way? And when is it to loosen up and let it go a different way? Or let's talk about parenting for a second. I mean, how fine is that line between being a control freak and an intentional parent? Or if you've ever led anything, an organization, a team, like, again, when do you go like, okay, I think you're going to find out that you're heading the wrong direction? Like, when is that good leadership where you just let it happen? And when does good leadership step in and go, now let me just tell you what we're going to do here because I know what I'm doing because I've been doing this longer? Did you ever struggle with control in your relationship, say marriage? Here's one of my theories here, because those of us who are the more controlling of the pair, which is my wife in our case, I think we get the bad rap because I think ultimately what we do is we cover over the fact that we all have control issues. And so there's always one person who's more controlling than the other. And so like if that's you get all the spotlight and they just get to like shine like a daisy outside of that spotlight, right? Because they're just a little bit less controlling. But the reality is, in fact, somebody said something to me this week in a council meeting. It was so life-giving, and it was one of those subtle little comments where they just said, we all have issues with control, Adam. I was like, oh, thank you, because I suddenly feel less horrible about myself. I say all that because, listen, part of the issue with Christmas is if we're not careful, we forget that for what is for some a season of incredible celebration is for others a season of horrendous grief. Some of the hardest stuff is brought to the surface. And I think the original Christmas story, my opinion, it has a lot more to say to that latter piece. That Mary's life in particular can really help us as we do the hard work of struggling. And I think some of our greatest suffering at sometimes is just our own propensity to feel the need to control everything. So here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're calling Mother Mary is I think the Catholics are right about Mary. And that I'm not Catholic. I was raised nominally Catholic. I have a lot of respect for some of you even who identify best with Jesus through the Catholic stream. I have lots of friends who do, so in no ways am I trying to be a criticism of that. And I'm not trying to suggest that we should pray to Mary or even that that's what all Catholic people think, nor am I interested in the nuanced conversations about things like perpetual virginity. Narrate Kids is a great place for your kids, by the way. But I do think they're right about Mary on this very issue, and that is that the longer I've stared at the text and the characters in the text, I think they're right in the adoration and respect they give to Mary. That though we don't get a lot of volume by way of explanation about her and her life and the circumstances, the closer I get to her story, and what I find in my own journey is I just keep looping every few years to these certain themes, and I feel like God is just like, until you get this, we're coming back to this one again. And Mary, for me, embodies a lot of these issues with control, but I also think that though there's not a lot of detail about her, the more you look at the detail we do have of her life, she is a stinking amazing woman, and not just because she gave birth to a baby, if you know what I mean. I feel like if we were in the South, I might have got an amen there. But she has remarkable character. And so here's what we're going to do is, for the last several years, we've started a series on Christmas Eve, just this intentional way of inviting people into our everyday Sundays in January. It seemed logical to do, probably is still the best thing to do. But this year, we're actually going to end on Christmas Eve. And that's not to say that we're going to leave people out who only experience Christmas Eve with us. We certainly have all that in mind. But what I want to do is spend several weeks taking a long look at Mary and some of the circumstances around her life, because I think she has a lot to say about the way we process life, especially this thing called control. So let's just jump in to Luke chapter 1. So in the Bible, we've got 4 major gospels, which are the 4 major accounts of Jesus' life. People debate, are they biographies or not? Doesn't matter. Luke, the most Greek of those gospels, the most left to right, kind of Western thinker of them, he picks up with Mary pretty early in his story. Verse 26 of chapter 1. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee. Now let's talk a little bit about Galilee and Nazareth. You can see on the map, Nazareth, most of the time when we're talking about the Galilee, which was the reason that which is the region that Jesus spent most of his time in, most of the time we're talking about fishermen, because that was the major industry, because most of the towns in the Galilee were along the Sea of Galilee, because that was their industry. Aside from their own kind of family plot of land, the major industry was the fishing industry. Not so with Nazareth. Nazareth, as you can see, is quite a ways off the Sea of Galilee. And Nazareth, much like every town in this region, was a lower class town. There was no middle class as we think of it in this day. But Nazareth's industry was stonemasonry. The Greek word that's often translated carpenter when speaking to Jesus' occupation, it's the word tekton. And the problem with translating tekton as one who works with things like pine and oak is the problem was Israel didn't have any. What they did have was a whole bunch of stone. Jesus was probably a stonemason. Nazareth was the center of the production of the stone in this region, which means that Nazareth, it's this very blue-collar, working-class, no-nonsense, spiritually devout, but no-nonsense kind of town. It wasn't famous for its universities. It wasn't famous for its intelligentsia. It wasn't famous for any of the kind of high-culture things. Nazareth was famous for its production of building stones. They would chisel them out of these quarries. Think Butte. Right? It's a working class town like Laurel, like East Helena, like East Missoula, like St. Louis, like Oakland. This isn't a town famous for its culture. It's a town famous for its hard-working people. And I think it's important to recognize that's the stock Mary came from. Not someone who was wearing a silk blouse and had her fingernails painted, no offense. But a woman of grit and hard work, who was raised in a culture of people who worked with rock for a living. That's Nazareth. Verse 27, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. Now, this pledge, of course, is referring to the Jewish system of marriage. We think that Mary was probably 12, 13 years old. Some go as high as 16. To me, that's a Western stretch on an Eastern reality. She's probably 12 or 13 years old. Joseph is probably 18, 19, 20 years old. This arrangement has probably been in place for years. Pretty early in Mary's life, in all likelihood, these families were working on an arrangement of their respected kids. But when the point of actual engagement happened, it was as formal to them as is a marriage ceremony to us. It was legally binding. To break an engagement required a legal divorce, which of course were impossible for women and very rare for men. But what we have here is two people who are deeply committed to each other, whether they like it or not. And to be clear, and this isn't a shaming thing, there's no sexual union going on here yet. They're living apart. In fact, in many cases, the wedding ceremony wouldn't happen for at least a year because the control of that was in the hands of the fathers. In fact, Jesus uses the metaphor often in the Gospels about the father gets to determine when the wedding's going to happen, and you better be ready for the wedding. He uses that to give reference to his return. One of the things we know is that the groom, he was obligated to go back to the family estate and add on to the house, build another room so that they could live in. So it's like he's going to live next to mom and dad who live next to grandpa and grandpa. Doesn't that sound like fun on your initial days of marriage? Nonetheless, that is in fact the culture. So this legally binding thing. Verse 29, the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." To which Mary the Catholic said, "And also with you." Right? Man, that's a flat joke twice in a row. I thought that was pretty good. It's just my own heritage, I guess. I'm not making fun of anybody. Let's be clear on that. Lots of respect. Now, question. Where do you picture Mary and Gabriel? Like, what's the setting? What's the scene? Was she in her bedroom? Was she sitting on her favorite rock meditating? Was she preparing a meal for her father and maybe brothers? Where was she when this exchange happened? If you were to draw it or sketch it or paint it or just think about it, what's interesting to me is I think many of us, we project Joseph's scene into this, which Luke doesn't tell us Joseph's scene, it tells Matthew does. But really, we don't get any detail. We're not really told where they were, what the circumstances were, how this happened. Did he wake her up from a dream? Was it a dream? Was it in her bedroom? We don't get any of that. What we are told is that she was frightened. And again, bear in mind, this is a 13-year-old girl in a religiously Jewish society in which women had very few rights. She was afraid. Verse 29, Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. Why? See, here's the struggle, and here's what I want to keep coming back to. You know how the story ends. Mary doesn't. Mary knows the Jewish scriptures, and she knows that when God shows up like this in somebody's life, it's either really good news or it's really bad news. She doesn't have anything to go with yet to know which one of those it will be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid." Oh, good. Mary, you found favor with God. So suddenly Mary now knows, like, okay, so it's good news. I get it. Okay, great. Thank you. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus. Now, it's impossible to know what Mary was thinking here, but I do think it's important to recognize this is a girl who was steeped in Jewish culture. And her story, her cultural narrative, the scriptures are full of women who, quite frankly, the prominent part of their story was God showed up in their life and told them they were going to give birth to a really important person. Think Sarah. Think Hannah, who I can't wait to talk about that story on Christmas Eve when Hannah was told that she would give birth to a guy named Samuel, who goes on to become a very important person in the text. So Mary is suddenly out of nowhere told not only that she's found favor with God, but that she is somehow going to give birth to someone quite important. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. Now, culturally here, when David was in power, which is way before Mary's day, that was the peak of Israel's success. Like that, I don't know what your favorite team is. Maybe you're the Bronco fan, or maybe you're a tennis fan, or maybe you follow business, but it's like the best of the best. And the people were like, okay, so David's in power. This is great. What happens when David dies? And the assurance was, don't worry about it. You'll always have a guy like John Elway as your quarterback, which turns out to not have been a true prophecy at all, we're finding out this year. But that's the tension in Mary. What happens when David dies? And the promise in the scriptures was, well, what will happen is there will be another David, and there will always be a David, and you can rest assured that God is always going to take care of you in that way. Well, the way the history played out, it didn't happen that way. That with each successive king, what you had was a less successful king, a less just king, a less kind king, to the point where God just took them away. First Assyria, then Babylon just destroyed this place. Now you have Rome, and for 400 years, no leader. And God says to Mary, not only are you going to give birth to a son, but it's going to be that David son that we've been talking about for a very long time, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. Not only are you going to have a son, you're going to have a very, very important son. Which leads to this question, if you're Mary. Crickets. How is this going to happen? I don't understand. Like, I've been through 6th grade. I've had the class. Like, I don't understand. How is this going to work out? How will this be, Mary asked the angel, since I'm a virgin? Told you, Narrate Kids is a very safe place for your kids. Or it leads to very good conversations after church. Either way, you choose your own adventure. To which the angel said this. The angel answered, the Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Again, impossible to know what Mary was thinking. Here's what some scholars think would have went through Mary's head here. Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1, the setting in this ancient cosmology is a creation that is completely chaotic. We talked about this last spring, that at the very least, what Genesis is saying is chaos was winning the day, ruling the day in creation. And Genesis chapter 1 and the opening verses tell us what? That God showed up in the midst of the chaos, and he was hovering over the chaos. Frankly, not altogether different than the things you've experienced in your own personal life when there's nothing but chaos around you, and when you look back, you go, but it was the weirdest thing. It was like God was present. And God says to Mary, that very same Spirit who constantly shows up and hovers over the chaos, he is going to hover over you and bring order to the disorder, both through this son and somehow a baby is going to come about. To which Mary said, and it's the gap between that and this that I want to spend the rest of our time, I'm the Lord's servant. Mary answered, may your word to me be fulfilled. Then the angel left her. Here's my question. Is it possible that, the invitation is stunning. It's remarkable. I guess my goal for the next 15 minutes is to convince you that her response is even more remarkable. That what's lost in the quick exchange of the written word is the reality of Mary's life that asks some pretty major questions about how in the world is this going to come about and how does this end? Because here's ultimately, I think, the question. Scott McKnight does a great job of asking this in a book he's written about Mary. Simply this: what was it like for a Jewish girl, a 13-year-old girl, from a very Jewish culture, in a very religiously serious, devout society, what would that have been like for her to have returned to her parents and said, I'm pregnant? What is that like? Knock, knock, who's there? You're pregnant, unmarried daughter. Seriously, not trying to shame anything, stir up anything, just what would that have been like for her? And what would it have been like for a 13-year-old Jewish girl, had she survived that interaction with her parents, to have in turn went to her hardworking, masculine, works with rock for a living in all likelihood, soon-to-be husband, and said, Joseph, I've got good news and bad news. Okay, what do you want first? Well, I'm a good businessman. Give me the bad news first. Okay, what's the bad news? The bad news is I'm pregnant. It's pretty bad. What's the good news? It's not yours. Has that even ceased? What does that exchange look like, right? I think you misled me. I think it's all bad news. No, but you got to understand. What would it have been like for this 13-year-old Jewish girl to tell her conception story to her parents? It's awkward to tell one that actually involves other people. How do you tell this one, right? What would it have been like for her to tell her fiance? No, you don't have anything to be, no, don't be insulted, don't be insecure. I'm telling you, it was God. And what would it have been like for her to have known she was going to live the rest of her life in a society that, whether it was true or not, wasn't going to necessarily care? Mary would have known the culture. She would have known the religious system. Deuteronomy 22 seems to summarize this quite well. Listen to the law, and this might offend you, but just hear me out. This is this culture. If a man happens to meet in town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, has nothing to do with rest, just in case we're clear there. You shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. Has nothing to do with any kind of hallucinogenic drugs. The young woman, because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife, you must purge the evil from among you. Like, taken literally, there's the law. Mary would have had to have known that. Now, in her day, she would have also known that there was some kind of modifications of this in her day. That the question becomes, okay, what if she says she's not an adulteress? What if she says she's innocent? Does she get a trial? Like, how do we know whether or not she's telling the truth? And if she says she's innocent, what do we do with that? What if she was raped? What if she said she did scream? What if her fiance has kind of got cold feet over the whole issue and he's stirring this thing up because he wants to marry a different girl, not her, and it would be great if she was out of his way? How do we know then? Mary would have known that there was a culture for this, and it wasn't any more beautiful. In fact, the culture was, you can read about it in Numbers 5, and if you struggle to reconcile the Old Testament to the New, this won't help you. But here's what Numbers 5 talked about, and Jesus' culture leaned into this. It's called the law of bitter waters. The command was this, or the idea was this, and we know that Jesus' culture practiced this, was that if there was a woman who was in question, then you bring her before the priest, and the priest makes for her a shake, but not with like kale and lemongrass and Greek yogurt and high in antioxidants berries, none of that. The shake was to consist of three things: holy water from the temple, from this sacred place, ink from the pen of the priest who wrote the curse that befalls adulterous women, and dust from the floor of the temple, dirt, dead skin scales, and all kinds of nasty stuff. And you put it all in a cup, and you stir it up, and you put it in your little bullet thing. And the idea was that then the woman is forced to drink this tonic. And the belief was that if her stomach swelled and she became ill, or she threw up, or if she became so sick she died, or if this caused the baby to become miscarried, then you've got your answer. She's guilty. And if somehow she's got an iron stomach and she can take all this and it has no impact on her whatsoever, then you know your answer. She's innocent. Mary would have known that not only was that practiced, and listen, you can think what you want about that, it was practiced in Jesus' day. Lots of these laws we read about, they were never necessarily practiced. This one we know was, and she would have known that in her culture, they upped the ante even more from there, and in fact, they did all this in the public square. What they would do is they would let down the woman's hair. Numbers 5 actually talks about that. The woman is to look disheveled. Any jewelry is to be removed. In fact, they would even go so far as to tear her robe, exposing one breast. Then she would publicly drink the tonic. And the idea was that all the young girls, especially in town, were encouraged to walk on by and take a good long look at what happens to people who do this. My only point here is this. Before we run too fast past Mary's story, what does it take to be the kind of person who hears all of this invitation and knows the reality she's stepping into and goes, sign me up? Like, what would have caused Mary, knowing her culture, knowing her religion, knowing what was practiced, knowing what was coming her way, how in the world does she say something as simple as, I am the Lord's servant. May it be as you have said. And I guess my question this morning is, could it be that you and I, in our own daily experience of life, aren't as far removed from these moments as we think? These moments where we have plans and life is headed in a direction and God shows up and does something absurd, or at least suggests something absurd, and we have these incredibly tricky decisions to make. Maybe we could ask it this way: what's the danger of making our heroes saints? Now, I don't mean this as a criticism of especially Catholicism. I get the whole sainthood thing, but my friend James provoked this conversation in us a while ago, and I thought it was worthwhile, and I think it extends beyond the way we even think about faith and character. What's the danger of inducting a guy, from the NFL into the Hall of Fame? What's the danger of labeling someone the greatest basketball player to ever play? Or let's just move outside of sports. What about in the world of what you do, in the world of vocation? What's the danger of somebody walking into your office, especially if you're somebody who's been doing what you do for decades? What's the danger of some 16-year-old who's mirroring you for the day in some kind of career class at high school, walking into your office and watching you do what you do and seeing how well you do it? What's the danger of that? What's the danger of you looking over your dad's paycheck or your mom's paycheck Maybe you're home from college and you see all the zeros. What's the danger of that? What's the danger of the first-year teacher sitting in the back of the classroom of the 15-year teacher and watching the excellence with which that teacher conducts her class or his class? What's the danger of that for the first-year teacher? What's the danger of talking about your business and having someone hear you talk about your business, and someone hears about it and frankly concludes like, well, of course that's successful. Like, given all those details, of course that's successful. I mean, if my dad did that, or if I found this then, or whatever, I'd be successful too. What's the danger of that? Isn't it that we actually miss all the difficulty that went into getting there? I mean, isn't the danger of saying to a guy like Tom Brady, yeah, you're the greatest ever, isn't the danger that we lose sight of the fact that he too was once a 12-year-old boy looking in the mirror with pimples on his face and wondering whether or not his life would amount to anything? Isn't the danger of somebody sitting in your office and watching what you do, missing the fact that you're 20 years into becoming good at what you do? See, isn't the real danger of calling someone with great character, or think of it this way, what's the danger of being 2 months into a marriage and having dinner with somebody who's 25 years into a great marriage? I guess my point is, don't we risk making everything look far easier than it is? And when we read Mary's story and we just kind of read it, isn't the danger that we miss that she was a 12, 13-year-old girl with dreams and ambitions and desires, people she wanted to impress, a culture she wanted to fit into. And God asked her to step completely outside of that. So we put a halo around her, but isn't the danger that we miss that her struggle with trust was real? That we take it for granted, but it was real. Bernard of Clairvaux is this Catholic priest from around the year 1000, and Pope Benedict actually tells a story about a sermon he preached in his commentary, which sounds like I'm trying to be pretentious, but it just happened upon, actually Pope Benedict wrote this brilliant commentary on the infancy narratives. And he tells a story about a homily, which is Catholic for sermon, about Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux, he opened his sermon by talking about how at the beginning of creation, way back at the beginning, there were two people, and sin completely overpowered their lives. Like they just couldn't keep it at bay. The result was death. And he went on to explain that in each ensuing generation, it was like the same story happened over and over. We could debate theologically, was that because it was in their DNA, or was that just because it's inevitable, that sin overcomes all of us? I don't actually think that matters for the sake of orthodoxy. But what does matter is that what Bernard was observing is that each person is wrecked by sin. And this God was watching it all. And he wanted to intervene. He wanted to do something. And yet the risky thing that Bernard of Clairvaux said that is still theologically risky in our own day was he said, but what God understood was that it was this thing called freedom that created this problem. And that any solution he would pose to the problem would have to work through human freedom. And so he watched and he contemplated and he wondered, but he knew every time he proposed a solution, it would require the yes of a person. It would require their participation, their collaboration. And then he got to this moment that we started by looking at, this moment where the angel Gabriel and Mary, or wherever they're at, having this conversation. Do this for a second. Let's have a how long can you hold your breath contest. Ready? Hold your breath. Ready? Okay, that's enough. I hate holding my breath. It's like the worst thing ever. I guess that's why I can't swim. I can, but not very effectively. What Bernard said was in this moment that we don't know exactly how much time elapsed, but when the angel Gabriel was speaking to Mary, that all of heaven was holding its breath, waiting to see what Mary would say. That the divine will of God was looking for a willing participant for what he was trying to accomplish. What if he's right? What if Mary wasn't the first Mary? In other words, what if lots of people have had invitations like that and no one else had the audacity to go, okay, I'll step into that? John Ortberg, one of my favorite communicators, he retold recently the story of the Good Samaritan, and in fact pointed out that there's really a subtle difference between the good guy and the bad guy in that story. The Good Samaritan, you've probably heard it referenced. You may not know the story. It's one of Jesus' more famous stories. It entails a guy who was beaten and left for dead on a remote stretch of road. And along came a religious person who had places to go and people to see and things to do, and he was very important. And he was also religiously pure, and he saw this person laying there waiting to die. And he knew that if he touched him or helped him, not only would he not make his appointments, but at the same time, the other thing that would occur is, quite frankly, he'd be religiously impure, and he'd have to go back home and deal with that. And so he scaled the wall. We know now this was a very tricky kind of mountain, slivery kind of road, and he got around this guy without touching him. And then along came a Samaritan. Now, it's important that we recognize what a Samaritan was in Jesus' culture, and I think the best way to kind of relate to it is whatever it is you hate, that's a Samaritan. Whether that's a political stance for you, or that's a social stance for you, or that's an Oakland Raider for you, like whatever it is, whatever that looks like, I'm just kidding, but at the risk of trivializing what you hate, that was a Samaritan. See, the Samaritans culturally, if we could do a little quick history lesson, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, they were smart people. And they understood that to really hold a section of the country or of the world, the best thing you could do was completely decimate their culture and their religious ideals and their own unique attributes. And so the Babylonians, they didn't just do that with club and fist. They did that with sexuality. The Babylonian pursuit was what you do is you force intermarriage of these two peoples, and then you assimilate their culture into ours, your own, knowing that in a couple generations it'll be gone because you've just brought these two cultures together and they won't even know how to celebrate Christmas anymore. Not that you know what I'm talking about. So what they would do is when they got to Jerusalem, a lot of the Jews killed themselves. Like, rather than do this, they took their own lives. It was their religious act of devotion. Those that didn't do that, those that intermarried, the Jewish men to Babylonian women, the Jewish women to Babylonian men, they of course had families. And those families had families. And some of those families didn't completely assimilate. Some of them held on to their Jewish heritage and their belief in this God of Exodus 34. Those are the Samaritans. What was happening in Jesus' day was that the religiously pure Jews in Jesus' day, they didn't respect the faith of the Samaritans because the belief was that if your parents or great-grandparents or whoever really loved God, they would have taken their own lives before they did that. And so they were outcasts. They were hated. They were reviled. They had no place. They knew suffering. And so Jesus, in Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, it's one of those guys who has no place in Jewish religious culture, who comes walking along and sees this person dead or nearly dead on the road and stoops and tends to his needs and carries him to a place where his needs can be further met, provides financially for that. And it's this paradoxical story Jesus tells. But what John Ortberg pointed out was that the difference between the Good Samaritan and the religious person was really one thing. That thing, and this wrecks me every time I hear it because I'm so terrible at this. The Samaritan was willing to be interrupted. The Samaritan was willing to have plans and go, well, I guess we've got a different plan now. The Samaritan was adaptable. The Samaritan had the capacity to go, this is more important than the plan I had for this moment or this day or this weekend. And I'm not claiming that's easy, but it's kind of merry, isn't it? All that got me thinking, if you'll humor me as I draw drawings. Some awesome person erased this for me from the last gathering. Thank you for whoever that was, because this is so sophisticated, it takes a long, long time. I wonder if part of what Mary points out, and I'm not claiming this is easy, I would in fact say I'm one of the worst at this, but if Mary points out that we're kind of all in that's not a very good X, if we're not all in a bit of a cycle, where at point X, God shows up and says, I know you thought you were going to do this for the next half hour. I knew you thought you were going to do this today. I knew you thought that you were going to do this with your life. But how about this? And God frequently, sometimes these trivial little things, sometimes as simple as like, hey, would you put your phone down? And sometimes there are these massive things. In fact, sometimes I think tragedy and things that aren't even necessarily of God's doing fit into this mix. And what happens is we're staring right at one of these merry moments where we go, well, it wasn't my plan, but I guess, like it or not, I get to choose whether or not I'm going to say yes or no. And I wonder if the reality is that what happens in the next season is we live out whatever decision we made there. Like, this is the reality, like for better and for worse. It's not that Mary would have died if she'd have said no. It's just that her story would be dramatically different and God's place in it. And if all of us aren't either at this place where we are here and now going like, oh, geez, this is one of those moments, or we're living that out, or quite frankly, we're on our way to the next one. And sometime later today or sometime tomorrow, like we're coming up on the next one of these opportunities, again, no matter how big or how small. I wonder if Mary isn't in fact a saint, but if we're not careful, we miss the real remarkable thing that she did, where everything she intended, everything she wanted, she went like, okay, thought I was going that way. Let's do this. Let's do this. Next week, I want to talk about this idea that called doesn't mean easy, but here's where this lands for me. Stealing this question, or I put a statement in the form of a question. What if, go ahead to that next slide. What if what Mary points out is that the life of faith means trusting we're being led to a place we do not know, on a journey we do not control? And what if one of the real dangers of Christmas is we think that the promises and assurances of Jesus of Nazareth mean that we have perfect control and understanding of our future? And Mary begs us to go, actually, no, that the opposite's true. That the life of faith is one where you embrace the fact that you don't always get to know where you're headed. And quite frankly, you don't get to control that. What you have control over is this thing called trust. Something we're going to continue to explore in the coming weeks. God, Lord, there's so many different layers of reality to this. Some of us are living this out, and it's something as inconvenient as a business appointment. And some of us are living out relational dynamics, financial dynamics, that even health dynamics that are so much bigger than we ever thought we'd be facing. God, thanks that you are the God who draws near in the midst of the chaos. God, thanks that your presence and power is bigger than our ideal circumstances. God, I pray that you'd give us the courage to identify these moments where we get to choose whether or not to continue in your direction, and that you give us the courage to walk them out. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.